The air in the photographer's studio was thick with the chemical stink of collodion and the dust from the heavy, moth-eaten velvet drapery. The photographer, Mr. Albright, a man of meticulous and artistic pretension, fussed with the head brace hidden behind the girl's back. "Just a moment more, my dear," he murmured, though his tone held no tenderness, only the impatience of a craftsman with a difficult subject. "We must have perfect stillness." The girl, who might have been 16 or perhaps a small 20, did not move. She was seated on a faux Grecian stool, dressed in a starched, borrowed calico dress that was too tight across the shoulders. Her hair had been painfully straightened and pinned into a style that was fashionable for white society girls 5 years prior. Her hands, resting in her lap, were the only part of her that seemed truly alive. They were broad, palmed with long, tapered fingers and knuckles that were slightly enlarged, like those of a musician or a weaver. They lay still, but they looked capable of holding continents of memory. Mr. Albright had been commissioned by a philanthropic society to produce a series of portraits images of former slaves now living in dignified freedom in the North. The narrative was to be one of grateful transition, of chaos turned to calm. This girl, listed in his ledger as Esther, domestic, had been brought to him by a society matron. She was described as quiet, biddable, and an exemplary laundress. But as Albright ducked under the black cloth of his large box camera, peering at the inverted image on the ground glass, he felt a flicker of unease. The composition was correct. The classical column, the potted fern, the diffused light from the north, facing window softening her features. Yet the subject's eyes, a dark, liquid brown, did not reflect the serene peace he was being paid to capture. They looked through the lens, through the wall of the studio, and into a distance no painted backdrop could conjure. It was an unsettling gaze, one that refused to be rendered merely picturesque. He took the exposure, a process requiring nearly half a minute of absolute stillness. The girl was a statue. Only when he emerged, blinking, and declared the session complete, did she finally move. She stood, her posture unbending from its rigid pose, and walked to the small dressing screen. As she changed back into her own simple wool dress, Mr. Albright busied himself with his plates. It was only later, in the red glow of his darkroom as the image slowly swam into existence in the chemical bath, that he saw it. There, in the silver nitrate and albumin, was the girl. And there, cradled almost imperceptibly in her folded hands, was an object he had not provided, had not even seen. It was small, dark, and intricately woven. It looked like a tiny basket, or perhaps a bird, fashioned from some humble material, corn husk, maybe, or river reed. It was a child's thing, a slave child's toy, and it was held not with nostalgia, but with the fierce, quiet grip of one holding the pin of a grenade. The Philanthropic Society rejected the plate. It introduces a discordant note, the matron wrote. The expression is not one of thankful repose, and that object in her hands, it suggests a fixation on the past. We require a portrait of the future. Mr. Albright, frugal and irritated, did not discard the glass plate. He filed it away in a crate marked misc and rejects. Where it slept for decades, the girl's unwavering eyes and her cryptic talisman waiting in the dark. April 1848, the Cypress Bend Plantation, Lowcountry, South Carolina. The world began with water and a secret. Hester was born not in the ragged row of cabins known as the quarters, but in a hidden, palmetto-thatched lean-to deep in the canebrake that bordered the swamp. Her mother, Lucille, a seamstress and lady's maid in the big house, had felt the pains come on too fast while gathering Spanish moss for stuffing mattresses. She had staggered into the green, whispering gloom of the cane, knowing the overseer, Mr. Booth, would not call the doctor for a maid's bastard child, and the midwife, Aunt Sarah, was 2 miles away tending to a fever. Alone, braced against a cypress knee slick with algae, Lucille brought her daughter into the world. She cut the cord with a sharp piece of oyster shell she carried for such purposes, and washed the child in the slow, tea-colored water of a nearby creek. The baby did not cry. She opened her eyes, dark as wet river stones, and seemed to listen to the chorus of frogs and the distant groan of a rice mill. Lucille, exhausted and bleeding, took it as a sign this child would be a listener, she would be quiet. In a world that prized loud obedience and punished loud defiance, silence might be a kind of armor. She named her Hester, for no one she knew, simply because the sound of it was like a whisper. The first memory Hester would later carry was not a sight, but a symphony of textures and sounds. The rough, sweet smell of her mother's neck as she was carried on her back, bundled in a sling made from a worn-out sack, the thump, thump, thump of the loom in the cabin as her mother worked late into the night, weaving cloth for the master's family, the cool, pliant feel of corn husks and river reeds in her small hands. Before she could walk properly, she could sit for hours, her tiny fingers manipulating the husks, folding, twisting, weaving them into shapes. She made little baskets no bigger than a thimble, birds with husk, feathers, flowers with petals of bleached white shucks. She did it silently, instinctively, her brow furrowed in concentration, creating a miniature world she could control. Lucille watched this and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from the cabin's chinked walls. Skill like that, an eye and hand that fine, was noticed. It could be a ticket out of the fields for a child, perhaps into the big house as a maid or a nurse. But it could also be a brand, marking her as special, as valuable property to be assessed, leveraged, or sold. Hester's father was a ghost story. He was a man named Isaac, a master carpenter from a plantation 10 miles down the river, hired for a season to build a new carriage house for Master Clayton. He and Lucille had stolen moments in the pine woods, whispers and promises that evaporated like morning fog when his work was done and he was sent back. Master Clayton, a tall, desiccated man with a lawyer's mind and a banker's soul, knew of the dalliance and said nothing. Isaac's master was a business associate. These things were regulated by a silent, brutal etiquette. The child that resulted was Clayton's property, pure and simple. Lucille received no word, no token. Isaac became a name she stopped saying. Cypress Bend was not a plantation of spectacular, theatrical cruelty. Master Clayton prided himself on running a rational operation. He believed in a steady, grinding pressure, not unpredictable explosions of rage. Whippings occurred, but they were administered by the overseer, Mr. Booth, a man with a face like a clenched fist and a voice that never rose above a low, grating monotone. The punishment was recorded in a ledger: Lucille, 5 lashes, tardiness from privy. The rationality was the horror. Everything was accounted for, even suffering. Hester's early childhood was a twilight existence, clinging to the edges of her mother's world. By the age of 5, she was tasked with fetching water, scaring birds from the kitchen garden, and minding the babies of other women while they worked. Her playground was the periphery, the dusty yard behind the cookhouse, the tangled bank of the irrigation ditch, the gloomy space beneath the big house's raised foundations, where she would watch the polished boots of the Clayton family pass overhead. It was there she first saw Master Clayton up close. She had dropped one of her little corn husk birds, and it had rolled into the open near the back steps. As she scrambled for it, a shadow fell over her. She looked up into a face that was long, pale, and curiously empty, like an unlined ledger. His eyes, the color of weak tea, swept over her without recognition, then down to the object in her hand. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was dry, devoid of inflection. Hester, her throat sealed shut with terror, could only open her palm. The little bird, a crude thing, sat there. He leaned closer, not out of curiosity, but as a botanist might examine an unknown weed. "Did you make this?" A tiny nod. He plucked it from her hand, held it to the light, then dropped it. It landed in the dust. "Idle hands make for idle minds. Your mother's at the loom. Find work." He stepped over the bird and continued on his way. The lesson was absorbed bone deep. Her making was not a wonder, it was idleness. Her creations were dust. Her silence, she understood now, must extend to her hands. She continued to weave, but only in the deepest night, by feel alone, hidden beneath a scrap of blanket, her creations immediately tucked into a hollow in the wall behind her sleeping pallet. The true separation came not with a dramatic auction block scene, but with the quiet logic of the ledger. Hester was 9. A fever had swept through the quarters, claiming several of the older people and 2 children. The plantation's human inventory was imbalanced. Master Clayton's brother-in-law in Georgia was expanding his cotton operation and needed fresh stock. Children were easier to transport and cheaper to acquire. They were also, Clayton reasoned in a letter, more adaptable and less prone to the nostalgic sulks of their elders. Mr. Booth came to the cabin one evening. He did not shout. He stood in the doorway, blocking the failing light. "Hester, gather your things." Lucille, who was mending a dress for Mrs. Clayton, froze. The needle hovered. "Sir, she's to help me with the mending for the missus. She's to help in Georgia. Master's orders, now." There was no argument. Argument was a currency that did not exist here. Lucille's face did not crumple. It turned to ash. She moved slowly, as if underwater, and gathered Hester's spare shift, her one pair of stockings. Then she reached into the hidden hollow and took out a small bundle, tightly wound in a rag. She pressed it into Hester's hands. Inside were a dozen of her tiny woven figures, a basket, a star, several birds. "You remember?" Lucille whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "You remember the making?" Hester, locked in a silence so profound it felt like death, clutched the bundle. She did not cry. She looked at her mother, memorizing the slope of her cheek, the scar on her brow from a long ago flying shuttle, the love drowning in her eyes. Mr. Booth took her by the arm. His grip was firm, cool, impersonal. As he led her away, Hester turned her head once. Her mother was standing perfectly still in the cabin doorway, a silhouette swallowed by the gathering dark. She did not wave, neither did Hester. The journey was a blur of misery, the jolting wagon to Charleston, the stifling hold of a coastal steamer smelling of tar and sick, the transfer to another wagon. She was part of a lot of 12, all children or young teenagers. They were fed gruel and watched by bored, armed men who spoke of them as one might speak of livestock. "That one's got a cough," one said, pointing to Hester. "Better not let Blythe see it, he'll knock the price down." Silverwood Plantation, Georgia, 1848-1854. Silverwood was a different kind of hell. Cypress Bend had been waterlogged and subtle. Silverwood was dry, brutal, and direct. It was a cotton plantation, a vast, sun-scorched empire of red dirt and white balls. The master, Josiah Blythe, was a man of God and cotton who believed the two were inextricably linked. He preached a short, fiery sermon every Sunday to his enslaved people, emphasizing obedience as heavenly virtue. His cruelty was not quiet, it was righteous, administered with biblical quotations on his lips. Hester was sent to the fields at age 9. Her first task was to follow the adult pickers with a sack, gathering the cotton they missed. The sun was a physical weight. The sharp, dried balls cut her fingers until they were cross-hatched with bleeding lines. Dust coated her throat, her eyes, her soul. At night, in a crowded, filthy cabin that smelled of sweat and despair, she would lie on the hard dirt floor, the bundle from her mother pressed against her stomach. She dared not open it. The feel of it through the cloth was enough. Her silence, which had been a private sanctuary, became here a liability. The other children, broken by the system, either retreated into mute shells or formed rough, quick alliances. Hester did neither. She worked, she ate, she slept. She spoke only when directly ordered, and then in the fewest words possible. The overseer, a man named Granger with a whiskey-reddened face and a constant sneer, took her silence for stupidity or insolence. "Cat got your tongue, girl," he'd taunt, leaning down so she could smell the rot on his breath. She would stare at a point just beyond his shoulder, saying nothing. This infuriated him. Punishment was a constant low-grade current, extra tasks, missed meals, the strap applied with casual efficiency to her back. Her saving grace, ironically, was her hands. After a year in the field, a drought cracked the land and the well near the weaving shed ran low. The pulley mechanism broke and the plantation's blacksmith was ill. Granger, cursing, ordered a gang of children to try to haul the bucket up by hand. The rope was coarse and heavy, biting into palms. As others fumbled, Hester, without thinking, examined the broken pulley. She saw how the pin had sheared. Finding a piece of scrap iron and a rock, she worked with a focused, wordless intensity. She didn't repair it, but she fashioned a crude bypass, weaving a section of pliable green vine through the mechanism to act as a temporary bearing. It held long enough to draw the critical water. Granger watched, his sneer momentarily replaced by a calculating squint. Strength was common, stamina was expected, but this was a form of problem-solving. It was a utility that transcended field labor. He reported it to Master Blythe. Hester was taken from the fields. She was not given to the blacksmith, for that was skilled labor reserved for men. Instead, she was given to old Mose, the ancient bent man who maintained everything on the plantation that wasn't metal or animal. The tools, the looms, the furniture, the bricks. His workshop was a dim, fragrant cave of wood shavings, twine, and patience. He said little, but his eyes were deep and knowing. Under Mose, Hester found a precarious sanctuary. She learned to mend a broken chair leg, to reweave a cane seat, to mix shellac. Her fingers, scarred by cotton balls, learned a new language of grain and tension. Mose saw her quiet skill and allowed it. He even once left a small pile of fresh corn husks on his workbench. He said nothing. She said nothing. That night, for the first time since leaving Carolina, she opened her mother's bundle. The figures were brittle, but intact. She took a husk from Moses' gift, and by the light of a single tallow dip, began to weave. She made a tiny, perfect brick. It became her ritual and her secret art. From husks, from reeds, from strips of stolen scrap paper, she would weave miniatures of the architecture of her bondage. A cotton ball, a hoe, the bell that called them to work, the bars on smokehouse window where punishments were meted out. Each piece was a flawless, terrible replica. She did not know why she did it. It was not an act of rebellion, but of documentation. As if by recreating the instruments of her captivity in miniature, she could contain them, understand their shape, and hold them in her hand where they were powerless. She hid them in a hollow space behind a loose brick in Moses' workshop wall. The collection grew, a tiny woven ledger, a Bible, a whip. A gallery of silent witnesses. Her relative peace lasted 4 years. Then, when Hester was 14, old Mose died in his sleep. His workshop was to be cleared. As 2 enslaved men pulled down a shelf, the loose brick was dislodged. A cascade of dozens and dozens of tiny, intricately woven objects spilled onto the dirt floor. Granger was summoned. He stood amid the scattered miniature hoes, bricks, and bells, his face purpling with a confusion that quickly hardened into rage. This was not idleness. This was a systematic, secret endeavor. It felt like mockery. It felt like a hidden mind, working where no mind was supposed to be. "Whose is this?" he roared. No one answered, but all eyes inevitably flicked to Hester, who was standing frozen by the door. Granger strode over and backhanded her across the face. The blow snapped her head back. "You, the quiet one, this is your devilry." He grabbed her by the arm and dragged her before Master Blythe, scattering the woven artifacts on the man's polished desk. Blythe, a stern man in black broadcloth, poked at a tiny woven whip with the tip of his penknife. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice cold. Hester said nothing. Blood trickled from her split lip. "She's making sport, Master," Granger spat. "Making little models of your property. It's disrespect, it's cunning." Blythe studied Hester. Her silence, which had once been a mark of simple obedience, now seemed opaque, impenetrable, full of possible defiance. A thinking slave was a dangerous slave. An artistic slave was an incomprehensible and therefore threatening one. "The spirit of rebellion can take subtle forms," Blythe pronounced. It must be rooted out, not with brutality, but with corrective labor. She clearly has an affinity for objects. Put her to the brick kiln. Let her make something of real use. The brick kiln was Silverwood's mouth of hell. It was a place of perpetual fire, choking smoke and back-breaking toil. Enslaved men, their bodies glistening with sweat and soot, worked in teams, mining clay, mixing it with water and straw, packing it into wooden molds, and feeding the endless, roaring fires of kiln to cure the bricks. It was a punishment detail reserved for those deemed strong, disposable, or, like Hester, in need of having their spirit crushed into dust. She was given the task of carrying the wet, heavy bricks from the molding area to the drying racks. Each brick weighed over 10 pounds. She was 14, small for her age, hardened by labor but not built for this. The heat was an assault. It seared her lungs, made the air shimmer, and turned her sweat into a gritty paste on her skin. The men around her, lost in their own misery, had no energy for camaraderie. This was the final escalation. The quiet cruelty of Clayton, the righteous brutality of Blythe, had now culminated in this inferno. Her hands, capable of weaving delicate husk birds, were now cracked and bleeding from the rough wooden handles of the brick carriers. Her silence became absolute, a wall between her mind and the reality of her body's agony. At night, in the women's cabin, she would lie trembling with exhaustion, her muscles shrieking. She could no longer weave. She had no materials, no strength, no privacy. The only thing she had was the memory of the making, and the feel of her mother's bundle, now hidden in a new place, under a stone at the edge of the ash pile. One afternoon, during a brutal heatwave, a new overseer for the kiln arrived. He was younger than Granger, with a restless energy. His name was Carter. He was not given to sermonizing or casual cruelty. He was obsessed with efficiency, with output. He saw the brickworks as an equation of fuel, clay, and human effort. He watched the workers with the cold eye of an engineer. He saw Hester stumbling under her load, her slight frame buckling. He saw her fall, a brick shattering on the hard ground. Instead of lashing out, he walked over, his boots kicking up powdery red dust. "You're too small for this," he stated matter-of-factly. "You're slowing the line." Hester braced for the blow. It didn't come. "Can you read numbers?" he asked. She looked up, startled out of her defensive silence. She shook her head. "Figures," he muttered. "Can you remember a sequence, a pattern?" She gave a tiny, uncertain nod. Carter pointed to the kiln's firing chambers, a series of arched brick ovens. "Each chamber has a number. They must be fired in a sequence, and the temperature must be watched. There are gauges, simple marks. I need someone to watch them, to call out when a chamber hits the right mark, to keep the sequence in their head. Can you do that?" It was a different kind of work. It required standing in one place, watching iron needles tremble over painted numbers, and calling out in a clear voice. It required a constant, vigilant memory. It was mentally taxing, but it was not physically crushing. It was, in the hell of the kiln, a reprieve. Hester didn't know why he offered it. Perhaps he genuinely saw her as inefficient in her current role. Perhaps he was experimenting. Perhaps in some small, compartmentalized corner of his soul, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't cruelty. It didn't matter. She took it. She learned the sequences. She learned to read the trembling gauges. Her voice, rusty from disuse, became a steady, monotone call in the roar of the fires. "Chamber 3 at mark. Sequence 2, begin." She was a human metronome for the inferno. Carter seemed satisfied. Her new position isolated her further from the other workers, who now viewed her with a mixture of jealousy and suspicion. She was the gauge girl, the overseer's pet, but Carter was not an ally. He was a utilitarian. One evening, as she was finishing her shift, he approached her. The main works were shutting down, the light dying in the sky. "You're precise," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've seen your eyes. You notice things." He paused, looking out over the darkening fields. "There's talk. Granger says you're cunning, that you had a whole world of little trinkets hidden away. That true?" Hester's blood ran cold. She remained silent. "A mind that can do that, it's a waste here," Carter said, almost to himself. Master Blythe is entertaining a guest next week, a railroad man from Tennessee. He's looking for reliable hands for a new line. He pays a premium for those with a particular aptitude. Steady hands, steady minds. They say the work is hard, but it's not the fields. It's not this. He gestured to the kiln, its embers glowing like demon eyes in the dusk. He looked at her. It could be a way out of Silverwood. The offer hung in the smoky air. It was not kindness. It was a transaction. Carter would get a finder's fee if she was recommended and sold. The railroad man would get a worker. And she would get what? A different kind of hell, a chance. It was the turning point, dressed not as a dramatic escape, but as a cold business proposition. To stay was to be crushed slowly in the brick dust or return to Granger's wrath. To go was to leap into an unknown that might be worse, but could not, in her mind, be worse than the kiln. And it was a way out. Movement, however dangerous, was preferable to stasis. She met Carter's gaze and gave a single, slow nod. "Good," he said. "Be at the stables Monday morning. Clean yourself up, and girl," he leaned slightly closer, "if you have any more of those little things, leave them behind. The railroad man wants blank slates." The railroad man, Mr. Sykes, had the build of a bulldog and the eyes of a speculator. He examined Hester and three young men from Silverwood not as people, but as machinery. He made them hold out their hands, examined their teeth, had them lift a heavy rail tie. He asked Hester to recite a sequence of numbers backwards, which she did in her soft, flat voice. He grunted, seemingly satisfied. The sale was swift. Master Blythe, pleased to be rid of a potential trouble maker and to turn a profit, signed the papers. Hester was loaded into a wagon with the others. She had retrieved her mother's bundle from under the stone. She did not open it. She simply held it in her fist, a hard, small lump of memory against her palm. The railroad camp in the hills of Tennessee was a raw, malevolent scar on the land. It was a world of mud, dynamite blasts, and the relentless driving of iron spikes. The work was indeed different. Hester was put to work in the tool and supply tent, sorting spikes, minding the blacksmith's fire, and running water to the crews. It was still brutal. The hours were endless. The food was scant. The white crew bosses were vicious, but it was a chaos with a horizon. The railroad was going somewhere. Each day the track lengthened. Each day they moved forward. That forward motion, however minuscule, fed a dangerous, fragile hope in her. It was here she met Elijah. He was one of the Hammer men, a powerful, quiet man in his 30s with a burn scar down one arm. He said little, but he watched. He saw Hester's efficient silence, saw her mend a broken harness with a piece of wire when the smith was drunk. One evening, as she was fetching water from the creek, he appeared beside her. "You from the low country?" he stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a question. She glanced at him, wary. "I can tell by the way you look at the water," he said. "I'm from Carolina too, near the coast." A connection, thin as a spider's thread, spun between them in the twilight. They did not speak of their pasts. They spoke in codes, in glances. Elijah began to leave small things for her. A particularly smooth river stone, a handful of blackberries. He was part of a different network, one she hadn't known existed in the camp, a network of information. He knew things. He knew the land. He knew the railroad's schedule. He knew which of the white bosses could be bribed with whiskey and which were irredeemably watchful. One night, under a sliver of moon, he found her alone. "They're moving the camp forward 20 miles in 2 weeks," he whispered. "There's a river, the Chickamauga, swollen this time of year, dangerous. The crossing will be chaos. Guards will be distracted with the equipment." He paused, his eyes holding hers. A person who could swim, who knew how to let the current take them, they might get across. On the other side, there's people, friends. He was talking about the Underground Railroad. He was offering her a map to freedom. Hester's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the dangerous choice, the true turning point disguised as a whispered sentence. To try was to risk being torn apart by river rocks, shot by guards, hunted by dogs, or betrayed. To stay was the known misery of the railroad, which would eventually end, only for her to be sold to some other hell. She thought of her mother's still silhouette in the doorway. She thought of the tiny woven brick in her hidden collection. She thought of the cold, assessing eyes of every master and overseer who had ever owned a piece of her life. She looked at Elijah's scarred, solemn face and saw not a promise of safety, but an offer of a chance to own the direction. She gave a single nod. The next 2 weeks were agony of a new kind. Every moment was fraught with the terror of discovery. She hoarded bits of food, a hard biscuit, a strip of dried pork. She observed the guards' routines. She practiced holding her breath. Elijah, at great risk, secured for her a small, sharp knife, which she hid in the binding of her dress. The day of the move dawned gray and drizzly. Chaos reigned as tents were struck. Tools were loaded onto flat cars, and mules brayed in protest. The camp was a churning mess of mud and men. The river, when they reached it, was a roaring brown torrent chewing at its banks. As a team struggled to maneuver a portable forge onto a raft, a mule spooked. It kicked, a man shouted, and in the confusion, Elijah bumped hard into Hester, sending her stumbling towards the tree line at the river's edge. It was not an accident, it was the signal. Without a backward glance, she melted into the underbrush. She ran, thorns tearing at her dress, until she found the spot he described, a huge sycamore leaning out over the water, its roots exposed. She clutched her mother's bundle in one hand, the knife in the other. She could hear shouts rising above the river's roar. Had she been seen? She didn't wait to find out. She slid down the muddy bank and into the icy, violent water. The current snatched her like a leaf. She was tumbled, submerged, battered. She fought not against it, but to keep her head above water, to breathe in the gasps of air between the waves. The far bank was a blur, something hard. A log slammed into her side, driving the air from her lungs. Darkness threatened to swallow her. She thought of the woven bird in the dust. She thought of her mother's hands. She kicked. Her hand slammed into something solid, a root, a rock. She clawed at it, her fingers finding purchase. She hauled herself, coughing, vomiting river water, onto a narrow shelf of mud and stone. She was on the opposite bank. She was across. She lay there, shuddering for what felt like an eternity. The shouts from the other side were distant now, swallowed by the river's noise. They would assume she'd drowned. She hoped they would. As dusk fell, she crawled into a thicket. Following Elijah's instructions, she waited. Just before full dark, a soft whistle, the call of a whippoorwill, sounded twice. She responded with a low cough. A figure emerged from the shadows, not Elijah, but an older black woman with a deeply lined face and eyes that held no surprise. "Come on, child," the woman said softly. "We got a ways to go tonight." The journey north was a phantom's pilgrimage. She was passed from station to station on the Underground Railroad, hidden in root cellars, secret compartments in wagons, and the attics of quiet, courageous people. She learned new words: freeman, agent, station master. She learned to trust in silhouettes and passwords. She never saw Elijah again. She hoped he was safe. Months later, ragged, thin, but alive, she arrived in Philadelphia. She was given the new name Esther for her freedom papers. She was taken in by the Abolitionist Society, taught to read a little, and placed as a laundress with a sympathetic Quaker family. She was free. On paper, in law, she was free. But freedom was a room she didn't know how to inhabit. The silence that had protected her now isolated her. The constant vigilance that had kept her alive left her jumpy, unable to sleep through the night. She worked diligently, her hands now chapped from lye soap instead of cotton balls or brick dust. She saved her meager wages. She was the model of a redeemed life, just as the philanthropic society wanted. Yet at night, in her small rented room, she would take out her mother's bundle. The figures were now fragile, some broken. She would lay them out on the thin blanket, the bird, the basket, the brick, the whip. And she would begin to weave anew. Not from memory now, but from the materials of her freedom. Scraps of paper from her reading lessons, bits of string, the clean, bright husks of sweet corn from the market. She wove a tiny railroad spike, She wove a river represented by an undulating strip of blue-dyed rag. She wove the sycamore root that had saved her, and she wove the face of the old woman who had met her at the river, a face of knots and lines and immense calm. She was building a new gallery, a testament not just to bondage, but to the journey through it. The act of weaving was no longer just documentation, it was integration. It was her way of stitching her shattered history into a whole, fragile narrative that she alone could hold. The society matron, pleased with Esther's quiet diligence, arranged for the portrait. It was to be a gift to her, a celebration of her new life. But when Esther sat before Mr. Albright's camera, dressed in another woman's clothes, posed in a fiction of peace, she knew the picture would be a lie. She could not show her face as they wanted it, so she showed her truth in the only way left to her. She had slipped one of her newest creations from her pocket. It was a tiny, perfect figure of a woman woven from corn husk and a scrap of the blue dress she'd worn on the river crossing. The woman was not running, nor was she kneeling in gratitude. She was simply standing, her woven head held high, one hand slightly extended as if feeling for a path in the dark. She held it cradled in her hands, a secret in plain sight, a testament, a rebellion of memory. The crate containing the rejected glass plate was sold in an estate auction in 1921. It passed through the hands of several collectors of photographic ephemera, none of whom paid much attention to the serious-faced black girl amidst the landscapes and stiff family portraits. In 2019, it was donated to a small historical society in upstate New York. A graduate student, Anya Sharma, was digitizing their forgotten collections. She was working late, her eyes straining at the computer screen as she scanned each plate. The image of Esther flashed into being. Anya was about to move on, cataloging it as a standard studio portrait, when she zoomed in to check for damage. And she saw it, the tiny woven figure in the girl's hands. It was unmistakable. Anya, whose own grandmother had woven intricate column patterns with rice flour in India, recognized the deliberate, skilled artistry. This was no accidental blur. This was a placed object held with intention. She zoomed in further, the girl's eyes. They were not looking at the camera. They were looking through it, into a distance filled with storms. Anya spent months in research. She traced the photographer's ledger, found the Philanthropic Society's records, their rejection letter. She cross-referenced names, bills of sale, railroad company logs, and fragmented records from the Silverwood plantation, which had burned in 1859. The trail was faint, but it was there. A bill of sale from a Josiah Blythe to a railroad agent named Sykes for one Negro girl, Hester, aged 14. A record from the Tennessee Railroad camp noting an enslaved woman had drowned in the Chickamauga River during a camp move in the spring of 1858. A later census record from Philadelphia in 1870 listing an Esther Freeman, a laundress living alone. No listed family, no listed birthplace. Hester had crossed the river. She had become Esther. She had survived. Anya published her findings. The portrait, once rejected for its discordant note, became iconic. It was displayed in a museum under a new title, Hester/Esther, holding her history. We look at her now, this girl who became a woman, who became a ghost, who became a photograph. We try to read her story in the set of her mouth, the darkness of her eyes, the extraordinary object in her hands. But the silence remains. We cannot hear the roar of the kiln, the groan of the rice mill, the rushing of the river that tried to claim her. We cannot feel the weight of the brick, the bite of the cotton ball, the rough comfort of her mother's hands. Her narrative was woven not in words, but in husk and reed and memory. Each tiny, perfect artifact she created was a stitch in the vast, frayed tapestry of lives deemed unworthy of recording. She documented her world not to beautify it, but to contain it, to hold its cruel geometry in her palm and know its shape. In the end, her greatest act of resistance was not her escape, a story of luck, courage, and the kindness of strangers, but her insistence on remembering. In a world that sought to break her body and erase her mind, she quietly, relentlessly wove a testament. She was not a victim awaiting rescue. She was an archivist of her own soul. And in that small, fierce figure held in her hands, a figure now seen by millions, we finally glimpse the truth she carried, that the story of slavery is not a simple before and after. It is a deep, continuous current of loss, resilience, and the unbreakable, often silent will to inscribe one's own name upon the world. Her legacy is not in the freedom she found, but in the unyielding memory she clutched even in a borrowed dress before a stranger's lens, holding the proof of her own existence tight against the coming dark.